The year is 1300, and the sun is rising over a small village in the English Midlands. Smoke curls from the roofs of some 30 houses clustered along a muddy lane. From a distance, they look almost identical. Timber frames, walls of woven branches packed with clay and straw, roofs of thatch. From a distance, this village looks like a community of equals. Everyone poor, everyone struggling, everyone the same. But walk down that lane, and the illusion collapses. One house has 2 rooms, a barn behind it, an ox team, and a full storeroom of grain. Another, barely 50 steps away, is a single smoky room where a family of 5 will eat 1 meal today, and it will be mostly boiled cabbage and coarse bread. These 2 families live in the same village, follow the same Lord, kneel in the same church, and yet they inhabit different worlds. So did medieval villages have rich and poor? The answer is yes, absolutely. And the gap between them was wider, more carefully measured, and more consequential than most people imagine. This is the story of how inequality worked in the smallest communities of the Middle Ages. And if you find this kind of history fascinating, the daily reality of ordinary people in the past, take a moment now to subscribe to Every Life Explained, because this is exactly what this channel exists to uncover. To understand wealth and poverty in a medieval village, you first have to understand the system that organized almost every village in Western Europe, the manor. A manor was an estate held by a lord, sometimes a knight, sometimes a monastery, sometimes a great baron who owned dozens of manors and never visited most of them. The land of the manor was divided into 2 parts. One part, called the domain, was farmed directly for the lord's benefit. The rest was held by the villagers themselves in exchange for rent, labor, or both. And here is the crucial point. The villagers did not hold equal shares. They never had. When royal officials compiled the Domesday Book in 1086, surveying thousands of English settlements, they did not record a mass of identical peasants. They recorded careful categories: villeins, who held substantial farms, boarders and cottars, who held small plots or almost nothing, freemen and sockmen, who owed lighter obligations, and slaves, who at that date still existed at the bottom of rural society. From the very beginning of the documented medieval countryside, inequality was not an accident. It was written into the structure of the village itself. The single most important measure of wealth in a medieval village was land. Not coins, not possessions, land. Land meant food, and food meant survival. In much of medieval England, peasant holdings were measured in units historians called vorgates, or yardlands, typically somewhere around 30 acres, though the exact size varied from region to region. A villager holding a full vorgate stood near the top of village society. With 30 acres, a family could grow enough grain to feed itself in a normal year, keep oxen or horses for plowing, run sheep on the common pasture, and still have surplus grain to sell at market. Below them came the half-vergaters, holding perhaps 15 acres, enough to survive on, usually, but with little margin when harvests turned bad. And below them came the cottars and smallholders, families holding 5 acres, 3 acres, sometimes nothing but the small plot around their cottage. Historians who have studied manorial surveys from the 13th century have found a consistent pattern across many English villages. Roughly speaking, a minority of tenants held the large farms, a middle group held enough to get by, and a substantial share of village families, often a third or more, held so little land that they could not feed themselves from it. Think about what that means. In the ordinary medieval village, a large fraction of the population was structurally poor, not because of laziness or misfortune, but because the land simply was not distributed in a way that allowed everyone enough. So, how did the land poor survive? They sold the only thing they had, their labor. The smallholder rose before dawn and walked to the fields of his wealthier neighbors, or to the Lord's domain, to work for wages. He plowed other men's land, harvested other men's grain, threshed in other men's barns. His wife and children worked too, weeding, gleaning, binding sheaves at harvest, spinning wool by the fire at night. Harvest time was the one season when labor was desperately needed and wages ran higher, and a poor family's survival through the winter could depend on how much they earned in those few frantic weeks of late summer. Manorial records show these payments in careful detail. So many pence for reaping an acre, so much for threshing a quarter of grain. And the records reveal something else. The people paying those wages were often not the lord at all, but the richer peasants of the same village. A vergator with 30 acres could not work all that land with family labor alone. He hired his poorer neighbors. In other words, medieval villages did not just contain rich and poor. They contained employers and employees, and both were peasants. Now look inside their houses, because the difference did not end at the field boundary. Archaeologists who have excavated deserted medieval villages, places like Warham Percy in Yorkshire, abandoned centuries ago and preserved under the turf, have uncovered the physical footprint of this inequality. The houses of wealthier peasants were long houses or multi-room dwellings, sometimes with a separate byre for animals, a barn, a yard without buildings. The homes of the poor were one-room cottages, small enough that a modern family car would barely fit inside some of them. Inventories and court records from the period let us glimpse what people actually owned. A prosperous villager might leave behind brass pots, a lead cistern for brewing, several oxen, a horse, pigs, a flock of sheep, stored grain, decent clothing, perhaps even a few silver spoons. A poor cottar's entire possessions might amount to a single pot, a stool, a threadbare blanket, and a hen. When medieval English governments levied taxes on movable goods, the assessments recorded village by village show exactly this spread. A handful of families taxed on substantial property, a middle group taxed on modest amounts, and many households owning so little that they fell below the tax threshold entirely and were simply left off the list. The poorest people in medieval villages are often invisible in tax records for the starkest possible reason: they had nothing worth taxing. Food told the same story. In a good year, everyone in the village ate bread, pottage, a thick soup of grain and vegetables, cheese and ale. But the quality diverged sharply. The wealthy peasant ate bread made from wheat, or a wheat and rye mixture, drank ale brewed from his own barley, and ate bacon from his own pigs with some regularity. The poor family ate bread of barley, oats, or whatever was cheapest, stretched with beans and peas, and meat appeared on their table rarely, on feast days, if at all. Harvest workers' meals, which employers were often obliged to provide, and which manorial accounts recorded, show that even medieval people understood this hierarchy of food precisely. Better bread and more meat for some workers, coarser fare for others. And when harvests failed, the difference between these diets became the difference between life and death. During the Great Famine that struck northern Europe between 1315 and 1317, when catastrophic rains rotted the crops for consecutive years and grain prices multiplied, the wealthy villager suffered, sold animals, ate poorly, and survived on his reserves. The poor villager had no reserves. Chroniclers of those years describe the desperate poor eating whatever could be found, and dying in numbers that historians estimate reached 5 to 10% or more of the population in the worst-hit regions. Famine in the Middle Ages was never an equal opportunity killer. It worked its way up from the bottom of village society, and it usually stopped before it reached the top. If you are finding this portrait of medieval life eye-opening, this is a good moment to subscribe to Every Life Explained, because every video on this channel digs into exactly this kind of question: how ordinary people in the past actually lived, ate, slept, worked, and survived. Now let's look at something even more surprising. Because wealth in a medieval village was not only about land and food, it was about power. Every manor held a court, usually meeting every few weeks in the Lord's Hall or even under a tree on the green. And this court regulated almost everything in village life: land transfers, debts, trespassing animals, brawls, the quality of bread and ale, inheritance. The court needed jurors, officials, and witnesses, and these positions went overwhelmingly to the same group of men, the wealthier tenants. The reeve, the villager who managed the lord's domain farming for the year, was chosen from among the substantial tenants. The jurors who decided disputes were the vergaters and half-vergaters, the ale tasters who checked the village brew, the haywards who guarded the crops, the men who assessed their neighbors for taxes again and again. Court rolls from hundreds of manors show the same family names appearing in these rolls generation after generation. Historians who have traced individual families through decades of court records have documented what they call village elites, dynasties of prosperous peasants who held the best land, filled the offices, lent money and grain to their poorer neighbors, and arranged marriages with the leading families of nearby villages. When a poor cottar stood before the manor court in a dispute with a rich vergater, the jury deciding his case was made up of the rich vergater's friends, relatives, and business partners. The village was a community, yes, but it was a community with a clear pecking order, and everyone in it knew exactly where they stood. There was another dividing line running through the village, one that cut across wealth in complicated ways, the line between free and unfree. A large share of medieval villagers were serfs, called villeins in England, personally bound to the manor. A villein could not leave the manor, marry off his daughter, or send his son to school or into the church without the Lord's permission, and permission usually meant payment. When a villein died, the Lord took a death duty called heriot, typically the family's best animal, at the very moment the household could least afford to lose it. When a villein's daughter married, the family paid a fine called merchet. These burdens were humiliating, and medieval people said so. Records preserve villagers going to court, sometimes pooling money for lawyers to argue that they were legally free. But here is the complication. Freedom and wealth did not always line up. There were free smallholders who were desperately poor, and there were unfree villeins holding 30 acres who were among the richest men in their village. A wealthy serf might pay his fines without blinking and quietly buy up more land, while his legally free neighbor starved on 3 acres. Legal status shaped dignity and obligation. Land shaped whether your children ate. Medieval villagers had to navigate both hierarchies at once, and the village land market is one of the most fascinating discoveries of modern medieval history, because for a long time, people assumed peasant landholding was frozen, the same families on the same plots forever. The court rolls prove otherwise. Villagers bought, sold, leased, and exchanged small parcels of land constantly, an acre here, half an acre there, recorded before the manor court with a fine paid to the lord. And in this market, wealth compounded. The family with surplus grain could buy land from the family facing a bad year. The widow, who could not work her holding, leased it to the neighbor with sons and oxen. Debt pulled land downhill from the struggling to the secure. Over generations, some families accumulated and others slid toward the bottom. Medieval villages even had a recognized category for those who reached the end of that slide. The old and landless could enter into maintenance agreements, recorded in court, in which they surrendered their remaining land to a younger tenant, sometimes a son, sometimes a stranger, in exchange for a guaranteed room, food, clothing, and firewood until death. Some of these contracts survive, and they are extraordinarily precise, specifying the exact bushels of grain per year, the right to a seat by the fire, the right to a bed. People made these agreements because they knew what happened to the old and poor who had nothing to bargain with. The village had no pension. Charity existed. The church taught that aiding the poor was a sacred duty. Parishes distributed alms. Monasteries fed beggars at their gates. Wealthier villagers left bread and pence to the poor in their wills. But charity was survival at the margin, not security. In the medieval village, land was the only pension, and those who had none faced old age with nothing between them and hunger except the goodwill of neighbors. Even the church, the one building that gathered every villager together, quietly displayed the hierarchy. Everyone attended the same Sunday Mass, rich and poor kneeling under the same roof. But the wealthy families paid for the candles, funded the repairs, and left money for priests to sing masses for their souls. Their names appeared in the parish records as benefactors, and everyone paid the tithe, 1/10 of their produce, to the church, a payment that weighed far more heavily on the family harvesting from 3 acres than on the family harvesting from 30. In death as in life, the difference persisted. The prosperous left written wills distributing animals, grain, and coins. The poor left nothing to distribute, and their deaths often survive in the record only as a single line, if they survive at all. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, the entire structure was struck by the greatest catastrophe in medieval history. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and reached England in 1348, and within a few years it had killed, by most historians' estimates, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. The suffering fell on rich and poor alike. Plague did not check tax assessments, but its economic aftermath transformed the balance of village society. Suddenly, land was abundant and workers were scarce. Wages rose so quickly that in 1349 and 1351, the English crown passed laws, the ordinance, and then the Statute of Laborers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, and the sheer volume of prosecutions under those laws proves how widely they were ignored. The landless laborer, for the first time in centuries, could bargain. He could demand higher pay, better food at harvest, and if his lord refused, he could walk to the next manor, illegally but effectively, where a desperate landlord would ask no questions. Surviving families absorbed the holdings of the dead, and men who had been smallholders became substantial tenants almost overnight. Serfdom itself began to dissolve as lords, unable to enforce the old obligations, converted labor services into simple money rents. The change was neither instant nor peaceful. Resentment over attempts to hold the old system in place fed into the Great English Rising of 1381. But the direction was set. Over the following century, English serfdom withered away, and a new rural order emerged, with prosperous yeoman farmers at the top, a broad group of husbandmen in the middle, and wage laborers below. Inequality did not disappear. It never disappeared, but the catastrophe had redealt the cards, and some families at the bottom of the old village order found, in the bitterest possible way, an opportunity their ancestors never had. So picture the village lane one last time on an autumn evening in the 14th century. In the big house at the top of the lane, the Vergatters family sits down to wheat bread, bacon, and ale, in a room warmed by a good fire, with a barn full of grain standing behind the house, like a wall against the winter. Down the lane in the one-room cottage, the laborer's family shares barley bread and thin pottage by the light of a single rush lamp, counting the pence earned at harvest, calculating whether it will stretch until spring. Both families will be in church on Sunday. Both will stand in the same fields, feel the same rain, fear the same famines. They are neighbors, and in many ways they need each other. One needs labor, the other needs wages, but they are not equals, and no one in the village would have pretended they were. Medieval people themselves saw their world as a ladder, and they measured every rung of it, in acres, in bushels, in animals, in offices held, and fines paid. The question this video asked was simple. Did medieval villages have rich and poor? The record answers without hesitation. Yes, in every surviving survey, every tax list, every court roll, every excavated house floor, the medieval village was never a community of identical peasants. It was a miniature society with its own elite, its own middle, and its own poor, bound together by need, faith, and the endless shared labor of the fields. And perhaps that is the real insight. Inequality is not a modern invention, and neither is the struggle to survive it. The smallholder who walked at dawn to work another man's land, the widow who traded her last acres for a seat by someone else's fire, the laborer who, after the plague, dared for the first time to name his own wage. These people were not background figures in history. They were most of humanity for most of history. Their world is gone, but the questions they lived with, who owns, who works, who eats well, and who merely eats, have never gone away. If you want to keep exploring how ordinary people face the hardest realities of their times, subscribe to Every Life Explained, because history is not only the story of kings, it is the story of everyone who ever had to make it through the winter.